Hey, y'all, this is Carla's husband, Jeff. Trent Schmiedehaus is a psychotherapist and relationship specialist. He helps couples and individuals soften barriers to love and create lasting, deep connection and intimacy in their lives. Trent takes a distinctly mind, body, spirit approach to finding relief from the trauma of stress in everyday life. He works from the premise that human beings are hardwired to be emotionally connected to one another and believes healthy, supportive relationships are central to the well-being of couples, individuals, families, and communities. Trent is also a dedicated Zen student. He daydreams often of ancient Chinese sages, talks to the moon, and lives in Austin, Texas with his wife, daughter, and 3 cats. And the reason I'm doing the intro today is Trent happens to also be our relational therapist. So let's go there.
Hey, y'all. Let's go there. Okay, so typically, Trent, welcome, Trent.
Thank you.
Typically, I will begin the podcast by explaining our relationship to one another and how I know you. Mm-hmm. But Jeff stole our thunder. Jeff did the intro for us. And I think that was his way of sanctioning this event.
Glad he did.
And telling us that he's okay with us coming on and doing this together.
Good.
Yeah. I am super honored that you would join us. And I just want to put it out on the table that when I first asked you to come on the podcast, there was some reluctance there.
Yeah.
And then I came back to you again and asked you again.
Yeah.
And one of your concerns was, is this the right thing to do? And I'd rather just talk about that now because I want to make sure we honor it.
Yeah, absolutely. Right thing to do in terms of, I want to respect your confidentiality and kind of that work that we do is sacred. You guys are important to me. And so I wanted to start there first and really kind of see what that was like. And that's where that conversation began, I believe.
Yeah.
There were other things that came up for me as we began. You mentioned this to me about a year ago, I think. We started kind of talking about it. And at the time, the way it registered to me was like, I really want to support Carla in doing this really amazing thing that she's doing. And I wasn't thinking about me so much actually being on the podcast. And sometime around the same time, I remember Jeff had kind of taken me aside. He's like, you're going to be on the podcast. You need to.
Oh, he did. I didn't even know that.
You need to be prepared. Like she's serious about that. So, that planted the seed. And then a couple of weeks ago, fairly recently, you mentioned it to me again. And I don't know what you remember about that conversation, but there was a lot that kind of came up for me in the beginning. So there was the piece about how much do we want to say about how we really know each other? What do we want to do with that information? And then there was my own reactions that I had, many of which I think I shared with you. So what happened for me was immediately there was this fear that came up. Don't do that. Nobody cares about what you have to say. Don't make yourself vulnerable in that way. Don't go messing up Carla's good thing. Right? Whatever that was, like a lot of, I think what I said to you was like, surely, Carla, you have more interesting people to interview than me. And, you kind of already know what I think. Like we talk about these things. So, and you were kind of looking back at me as I said these things kind of incredulously and kind of like, what are you, nuts?
It's true.
Yeah. So I think we kind of moved past that. And so I'm personally, like, I can feel that vulnerability now, that wanting to hide. These are very old kind of reactions that I have. And I'm also glad that I'm here.
Oh, that makes me feel a little relieved.
Yeah, sorry to kind of bring all that to you.
No, that's okay. I would just never want to push you.
I didn't feel pushed at all.
Okay.
Not at all. I just wanted to, these reactions that I'm describing for you are not new. Right? They've been with me a long time, but I was a little bit surprised at how strongly they came up.
Yeah.
I'm also really glad to be doing this with you.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And what drove the change of heart? What made you decide to say yes after all?
Well, that's a good question. I kind of see this as an opportunity to really do real time work on myself in some way and step beyond some of these, um, in many cases, like old beliefs and stories that served a purpose at one time in my life and now kind of limit me. And I just kind of saw this as a cool opportunity.
Yeah.
I'm having these conversations in my head all the time. That's a pretty safe place to have them. But I'm not accustomed to having these conversations in a public way. Talking about myself, that is. So I don't know. I kind of saw it as a cool opportunity to do something different and have a great experience doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's have some fun.
Let's have some fun.
I totally agree. I think your work is so important, Trent. And I really want to honor your professionalism. You are tremendously professional in the way in which you do your work. I also want to honor Jeff.
Yes.
And respect him in this. And, but I think, for me, and I have a tendency to be a little unboundaried. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't,
You heard it here first.
Yeah. I break through traditional boundaries all the time. And so I wanted to make sure that I was being respectful of yours as well and honoring and hearing you. But I'll tell you from my perspective, Trent, I think the world needs to know about the work that you do. And I think you're a tremendously interesting person and you have helped me tremendously. And I think that the work that you do isn't just valuable for a marriage, it's valuable for all relationships, all types of relationships. Yeah. So that being said, why don't we get into that a little bit? Okay. Tell us what is the sort of work that you do and what we'll start there. What is the sort of work that you do, Trent?
Well, I'm a psychotherapist and I work primarily with couples. I'm kind of a relationship specialist, I guess. And my goal is to help soften barriers to love and connection for partners. I have kind of a particular way I go about it, just, in terms of the modality that I use. I'm really impacted by relational life therapy. So that's you've heard me using that language a lot, and it's a modality that I have a lot of confidence in. But it's really about helping people get beyond the painful cycles they're in, do something different, and experience more intimacy, more vulnerability, more empathy, more accountability. And I kind of help show people how to do that. The way I do it is a little bit different than traditional talk therapy in that in traditional talk therapy, there's, you've got this kind of open holding environment where there's a lot of reflection, a lot of space, a lot of support, right? And that's all there in what I do, but I'm much more directive and I do a lot more coaching. I certainly want to provide that good holding environment so people feel safe and seen and taken care of. Those elements will always be there. But I'm a lot more active. Like I get in the system with people. I ask a lot of questions. I want to know stuff. I interrupt a lot. I really, again, do a lot of coaching. Let's try this. Let's stop. And once we've identified, for example, the cycle that people get into, we want to interrupt that. Here's what we're doing. Are we in the cycle? Let's try doing something different now. So there's a lot of kind of real time. Let's do this, right? But similar to traditional talk therapy, I'll ask people, like, are you interested in some coaching right now? Can I offer you my perspective about this? So I'm getting permission with people. I'm not just like jumping in and, taking over, but it's a lot more active.
I agree. And I would say that's what I actually like about it. It's so actionable. You call us out on our bullshit. I historically have not loved therapy. Quite frankly, it made me feel worse. Yeah. And I was very resistant of it. And what I didn't know enough to know that I was going to traditional talk therapists. And I was really hungry for someone to call me out. Yeah. And my coach was the first one to do it. And then our first meeting with you, what you said that for me sealed the deal is you said, I don't work for you, Jeff, and I don't work for you, Carla. I work in service of the relationship. And if you guys are doing things that aren't in service of the relationship, I'm going to call you on it. Yeah. And I was like, hot damn, that is what I want, you know.
All right, good.
And I need tools and language. Because let's be honest, being in a relationship is hard.
Yeah. And using the tools and actually doing something different is hard. So I tell my clients this from the get-go and throughout the course of therapy. What I'm going to ask you to do may not come naturally. It's not going to feel instinctive, and it's hard. It really requires a lot of practice and dedication. So to your point, I'll say to people, you know, my client is actually the dance you're in. It's the relationship itself. Not that you as individuals aren't important, but when we see the stuff that you're doing that's getting you into trouble, right? That's really where the action is. That's what we want to look at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. At one point, I know I told you this. I got sucked into the reality therapy show. I'm forgetting the name of it now. It's a traditional talk therapist that works with couples. I think it's called couples therapy. And I got sucked into it. The voyeur in me just loved watching it. And then increasingly I started to feel icky watching it. And it was kind of taking me down. And I had two conclusions. One, I felt like these couples weren't being given tools. And I would notice moments in time where I bet Trent would have interjected and noticed that there was a need for repair there, for example. But the other observation that I had was, damn, it's got to be so frustrating. And this is me projecting onto you to sit there and watch these couples come in, sometimes every week, saying the same damn things and being locked in the same stories. How do you deal with that, Trent? And how do you take care of yourself and your own energy when you can be in kind of these heavy conversations?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think what I normally do is I call it out. I bring it to people's attention. Right? Here's what I'm noticing. Like, here are our goals. Here's what we talked about wanting to change. And yet this is what's going on. What do you think about that? And so there's this kind of like gentle but firm inviting people to step out of that. This is a moment where we can do something different. Are you interested in doing that? And then we kind of take it from there. Making change is difficult. Like, that's the hardest part, really. Building perspective, hearing about the tools, making sense of them, that can be hard enough, but that's really the easiest part. The hardest part is actually doing it different. And many couples that I work with are kind of waiting until it's too late. Like, we need to learn to like back this up like 25 steps and intervene earlier for ourselves. So we're not at a place where we don't even have access to the parts of our brain that can think consequentially and that can soothe us, right? And so I may be getting a little off topic here, but I think that's part of it. You call it out, you name it, you invite people to want to change it, and you make it clear, this is what we're talking about here, right?
Yeah.
How badly do we want to change this?
And what happens when they don't? Do you find yourselves, I mean, this is a harsh word, but do you ever fire clients because you feel like they're just not willing to do the work? Or what happens when they don't?
Well, in my experience, so that's rare. That happening is very rare. If I were to do something like that, that would probably come on the heels of doing a lot of validation, reminding people like, this is tough. What I'm asking you to do is tough. And this is where the work is right now. Most clients that are not as motivated to change kind of fire themselves in a lot of ways.
They opt out.
Yeah, sometimes they do. So I don't find myself normally having to, I mean, you bring it to people's attention and it gives an opportunity to bring awareness to it and do something different. And a lot of times these cycles that people get into, again, they feel normal. They feel it's like a vortex. You get pulled into it and you don't know what to do differently. And so, you know, it takes time to get people to really see, oh, this is what we're doing. This is what Trent was talking about. It's one thing, you know, people have me for 90 minutes a week. They're out in the wild, however many other minutes there are on the week. And so we have a little time to practice here. And so I'm calling it out, kind of tying it back to their original goals and what they want to see different, usually kind of wakes people up. And sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. I feel like that's the phase I'm in right now. So, and I'm ready to get over the hump on it, but I feel like I'm in that phase where I'm now observing the pattern. Yeah. And I know I've told you this before, like I can see what I'm doing that's undermining the relationship. And I'm like, damn it, but I can't seem to change it. Or I'm annoying myself. I'm irritating myself because I'm just in observation of it. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, this is when I typically retreat, or this is when I typically do this. And I'm going to try to do something different, but at that, it's so hard to actually get yourself to do something different, even when you see it.
Well, and it's vulnerable. Like, what's going to happen if I actually do something different here? Like, everything inside of me says retreat, lash out, do whatever it is we do. I'll get some short-term benefit from it, right? I'll be protected. But a lot of times when we do that, we're trading feeling better for getting better. Right? I will feel a little bit better right now. I'm not entering into a conflict, or I'm, whatever short-term relief we're getting from that, but we don't practice something different. So, in those times when you have the awareness, then to be aware, right, is to have the ability to change something. And so that's the toughest moment. What do I want to do right now? So in RLT, relational life therapy, for example, we always emphasize change. Right? Everything inside you right now might be wanting to do what you normally do, right? You want to protect yourself. You want to work on the relationship. And so with enough practice, we begin to bring that awareness to bear. And with a little luck and some persistence, we start making other choices. Yeah. And it's vulnerable. Yeah. So a lot of people come to therapy with some usually unexamined idea of, I am 100% dedicated to doing the work of getting my partner to change.
I'm glad you brought this up, because that's where I was going to go.
Very common, right? And a lot of it has to do with, well, what are you going to do? If I do something different, what are you going to do? And that's a tough moment. We don't know. We don't have any control over what our partner does. So you've probably heard me say, if I do something different, okay, what I'm doing is changing the system. I'm changing the dance. I've kind of done my part, so to speak. What I'm also doing is inviting my partner to have a different experience of me. And if they have a different experience of me, maybe it invites them to do something else. Now, that part is not up to me. I'm not in control of that. But it creates better conditions, better circumstances for me to get my needs met when my partner kind of sees me doing something different. Doesn't always look like that. Yeah. Sometimes they don't do anything different. And then there are other perspectives and skills we have to bring to bear in those moments.
Yeah. One of the things that you taught me is grieving it. Yeah. So grieving the parts of the relationship that you're just not going to get.
Yes. Yeah.
And accepting it. Yeah. And recognizing that you're not there necessarily to change your partner.
How you doing with that?
That's tough. It's really tough. But it, and you know better than I do. I'm not great at it, but I'm working on it. Yeah. And thanks to you. Yeah. And there's a recognition there, and a recognition. I will say, there's also a recognition that needing to be able to grieve those things, needing to be able to accept the things that you're just not going to get in the relationship, and that's okay. I have a friend that says that's what we have friends for. Like, you're not going to get everything from your partner. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about another concept that you've really helped me and us with, which is this notion of the adaptive child versus wise adult. Yeah. And when you're in your whoosh, will you explain that a little bit to me? Because I think that is kind of at the heart of the change, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's foundational. So first of all, I'll say I know this as a partner, not just as a therapist, right?
I think that's important.
Yeah, as a married person, as just a person out in the world, right? So the way I like to think about it is we've got like three basic parts of our psyche, okay? One is, I call it, I've kind of adopted a lot of these names and kind of taglines from Terry, because he's had such a big impact on me. So I want to give credit where credit is due.
Terrence Real.
Yes, Terrence Real. Wounded child. So this is a part of us that's usually very young, very vulnerable, that was on the receiving end of our caregivers' lack of skill or inconsistency. The part of us that was on the receiving end of playground bullying, whatever that might have been, right? And so it's kind of, it's scared. It's very fragile and very raw. Okay. The second part of our psyche is the part of us that responded to that wounding and learned, I don't know, through our family of origin, popular culture, our friends, media, magazines, whatever it is. Here's how I protect myself from this wounding, right? Here's how I get love and connection and safety in this family that I'm going. We all do this, by the way. Nobody's exempt from that. That's the adaptive child. So the adaptive child is kind of like whatever knee-jerk reaction we have to being scared or hearing something from our partner that we don't like, or whatever, seeing a bad driver on the road, that anything like that that gets our attention. So that adaptive child is kind of a protective mechanism, right? What's important about the adaptive child, is that it doesn't use skills. Its only job is to protect us. It's doing whatever it learned how to do to protect us when we were young and vulnerable. So it's not wrong, and it's actually not bad. We're not trying to get rid of it in our work. We're trying to recognize it and make conscious, intentional, relational choices about what we do next. So you mentioned the whoosh. So the whoosh is basically that somatic experience, those physical feelings that we feel in our body when we're scared, when we're confronted with a partner that's letting us down. Anything like that, you feel it in your body. Right? The ability to notice that and track that is what slows the process down enough so we can make a choice. Because if I'm not able to make that choice, I'm going to go through door A, which is what I normally do, the knee-jerk thing. I yell, I get intellectual, I shut down, I start saying too much, and I'm doing all this unbridled self-expression, all that kind of stuff. If I don't, if I'm not able to track it. So tracking it gives us choice. Like those physical sensations are the most reliable data that we have because they're always going to feel the same way, right? If I'm scared or if I'm angry or whatever that is, it's not going to feel differently tomorrow. So tracking that lets us know, oh, I need to pay attention to this. If I don't, I'm going to go down the wrong road here and maybe cause more pain and suffering for myself and my partner. That's the whoosh. So that's kind of like the uber skill of relational work is tracking your whoosh so you can make a decision about what it is you do next.
Yeah.
Does that sound right to you?
It sounds perfect. And, I think the important thing to call out is whoosh happens everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, it's going to happen. It's not a function of avoiding it. It's what you do with it. It happens in the workplace. It happens, like you said, in traffic. It happens in your marriage. It happens with friends. It happens anytime you're particularly triggered.
It happens when somebody you really care about invites you to do something wonderful.
Say more about that.
Well, you saw me in my whoosh.
Right? That's true.
You saw me in my whoosh. And everything that came with it. Right? That was my whoosh.
Yeah. That's so
That's
true.
one way I experience it.
Yeah, it isn't. That's so beautiful, Trent. It is an invitation to hold space for someone. And you're absolutely right. This is the big unlock.
Yeah.
So, because one whoosh can trigger another whoosh.
Yeah.
But to be held in your whoosh is it's so wonderful when you are in that space and the other person recognizes it and is there for you. Yeah. It's a really beautiful thing. Okay, so that is the whoosh, and that is the adaptive child. Tell me a little bit about the wise adult. What's the difference between the adaptive child and the wise adult?
So the adaptive child is automatic. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to plan for it. It's going to happen automatically, right? It really kind of resides in the lower regions of our brain that are really responsible for threat detection and safety. Right? That's kind of its main thing. The wise adult is our forebrain. Prefrontal lobes, a part of us that can think consequentially, that can assess for consequences, that can make choices, right? That can soothe the lower parts of our brain, if you will. That has to be cultivated. That's not automatic. Adaptive child's automatic. When you're tracking your whoosh and making a choice, you're choosing for your wise adult. The part of you is like, how is this really going to be if I do or say this thing that I'm thinking about? That has to be kind of reached for. Now, of course, the more that we do it, the more we strengthen that, and the easier it becomes to recognize and make those choices. Nobody's in their wise adult all the time. Okay? I've met some people who think they are, but not so much, right?
Yeah.
So we have to choose that, but choosing it again and again is how we move into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the difference there. Automatic, something we have to cultivate and reach for.
Yeah. Okay, so now I want to take us to a different concept that you talk about, which is, see if we can explain this in words. We might have to have a visual aid at some point linked to, but it's the quadrant where you map out boundaried and unboundaried on one vector, and on the other vector, there's, am I getting this right? Walled up and one down. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Getting close. I think I know what you're describing.
Okay. Yeah. If you'll take me through that quadrant. Okay.
So what I think you're describing is what we call a relationship grid.
Okay. That's it.
Yeah. Sound familiar to you?
Yes.
Okay. So it's a self-assessment tool, basically. And it helps us understand where we go and what we do when we get triggered. So to your point, it consists of two axes, like a vertical axis and a horizontal axis, and then that kind of center right in the cross where the two axes intersect. So if you think about I'm going to get horizontal and vertical mixed up. I do that all the time. The vertical axis, like this. At the top of that axis is what we call grandiosity, right? At the bottom of that axis, we call that shame, kind of toxic shame, right? There's a second axis, and that is the axis of boundaries. At one side of the axis, on the far right side, is being boundaryless, right? Not enough protection, not enough containment. Over on the other side of that horizontal line is being walled off, too much boundaries. Nothing comes in, nothing goes out, that kind of a thing. When you put those two axes together, you get those four quadrants, right? An intersection between being one-up grandiose and boundaryless. That's kind of where rage lives in that quadrant. That's where, how do I want to describe that?
Like an archetype, maybe a
kind of an archetype, but people that live in that quadrant, right? Again, rage is the primary energy here. Here's what I'm feeling. I don't have any boundaries, so anything that I'm feeling or think is going to come right out. And I kind of feel entitled to do it, right? My one-up grandiosity. So let me say this. So when you're thinking about grandiosity and shame, the core energy of both of those is contempt. So when I'm in grandiosity, my contempt is for others. Like the spotlight of contempt is on other people. It's not on me, right? When I'm in grandiosity, it impairs my ability to assess negative consequences. I tend to have a lot of empathy for myself, but not so much for other people, right? So it's really kind of about you and the stuff that you're doing. If I'm in shame, then of course it's the opposite. I'm in this kind of, I'm unlovable, unworthy, I'm kind of a shit, I'm stuck here. And a lot of times when we're stuck in shame, what we tend to do with our partners is like, I feel so bad right now about what I've just done or said. You have no reason to be mad at me any longer. You need to come over and make me feel better about what's going on. Okay. So the other piece that's important to know is that both grandiosity and shame disconnect. Where we want to be is right in the center in relational health. That's where our wise adult is. Not grandiose, not in shame. And we all have a relationship to grandiosity and shame. We all do this, right? But part of that learning to track the whoosh is learning what it's like. Oh, I'm kind of going up into shame. How interesting. I want to kind of do that hard work of self-correction, come back into the center, relational health, wise adult, because I can't love from above. I can't love from a place of disconnection or from a place of shame, right? Yeah. So that's what that's all about. So again, back to the grid. Each one of those quadrants has specific things we tend to do, qualities, behaviors, attitudes. It's not always a matter of behavior. It's also a matter of kind of where we go in our attitude. So again, the intersection of being one up and boundaryless, that's where rage, that's where entitlement lives. That's where, again, I don't have any boundaries about what I say and do and think, so I'm just going to enact it. And I'm kind of entitled to do that. Whereas if you are one up grandiose and walled off, the energy there is a little bit more about superiority.
And stonewalling, I'm guessing?
A little bit, yeah. A little stonewalling. It's like, I'm not going to tell you anything about what I think. Why would I? Any idiot would see that I'm right. Whereas, with being one up and boundaryless, it's coming at you. And it's coming at you with a lot of force. It's coming at you with a lot of contempt and with a lot of rage. Here, it's a little more of a cooler, detached type of superiority, condescension lives up here. Right? Does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, totally.
So with each one of these quadrants, what I like to, assist clients in doing is figuring out, where do you tend to go, right? When I'm triggered, I tend to be a little bit grandiose and walled off. I'm a therapist. I know how this stuff works. you know?
Yeah.
That's not very helpful with my partner, you know?
Yeah.
And so having that information about myself helps me to course correct. Right?
Yeah.
There are two other quadrants that we haven't mentioned.
Yeah. Tell me about them.
So, okay. So another one of the quadrants is when we get shame-based and boundaryless. That's kind of where desperation, clinginess, codependency lives. Mm-hmm. I can't feel good about me unless you feel good about me, right? I don't have any protection here. So I'm kind of like, you know, an emotional snake. I'm relying on you to keep me warm and make me feel good about myself. And so you know, a lot of the, it's kind of like the quadrant of the Disney princess, right? Just kiss me and wake me up and love me and then
save me.
Okay.
Yeah.
A lot of it can look like, have you ever, I don't know, seen somebody, you ask them like, how are you doing? And they're like, fine. You look at it, you're not fine.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's that boundarylessness that kind of invites somebody into like, I want you to ask me how I'm doing. I want you to give me permission to feel how I'm feeling versus kind of making that wise adult decision, which is like, you know what, I'm really upset about this right now. Can we talk about this? Or I'm upset about this and it's not the time for me to deal with this. So not making that honest choice, but more like getting you to come check on me. Or at the same time, maybe I'm really moving into like monitoring everything you're doing so I can keep myself from feeling anxiety or something like that. A lot of that stuff happens in this quadrant. Shame-based, unworthiness with complete and total boundaryless. So I'm really kind of dependent on you to feel good about me. Mm-hmm. One of the problems there is when you don't feel good about me, and you won't from time to time, I'm flailing, right?
Yeah.
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 The fourth quadrant is being shame-based and overly boundaried and walled off. That's kind of where the energy of depression resides. Not clinical depression, but like a depressed relational stance. Doesn't matter. You know,
apathy.
It's not going to work. Apathy. It's not going to work. Like, why even try? You're not going to change anything. I'm not going to change anything. So, you know, whatever. That's kind of the core energy there.
Yeah. So how are these quadrants helpful and not helpful? Because I could see if you're not careful in teaching this to couples, that they could weaponize this. Like they could say, oh, you're totally grandiose right now and you're being unboundaried, or, you know, and I don't need that right now. Or how is this information helpful and how should it be utilized?
Yeah. Well, so one of the things I will say to clients, for example, is this is not for you to take your partner's temperature with, because that would be an adaptive child strategy. Are you being grandiose right now? That's not going to go over very well. So this is about me assessing where I go so I can course correct. Of course, it's going to be tempting to look at that grid and go, oh yeah, that's what my partner does. Oh yeah, that's what he does. And you know, maybe there's some truth to it. But that's not what it's intended to be used for. This is a self-assessment tool. That's the way I think about it. So I tell people, don't weaponize this. If you're wanting to move back into connection, right, that's not the way to do it by saying you're being one-up and grandiose right now. And of course, I know people are going to do that. So there has to be some practice around that to remind people, I think, that this is about you working with you. It's not about getting your partner to do something different.
Yeah, that's so interesting that in relating to somebody, you really have to get yourself sorted. There's another tool that I want to mention that has been very helpful. And it's, in fact, one that I use with my teenagers, which is the repair wheel. And I'm still not great at it. It's surprisingly difficult to get right. Will you walk us through what a repair wheel is and when you use it and how to use it?
Sure. So every relationship is somewhere in a cycle of, you know, harmony, disharmony, repair, and a return to harmony. There's no fixed place that a relationship resides in. We're always in that cycle. Skillful couples are better at doing things like bringing skills on board, using the feedback wheel, repair wheel, as you said, and spending less time in disharmony and moving through the repair process and getting back into harmony sooner. Okay? And so this is what this is for. So it's a structured way of complaining, basically. Everybody needs to complain from time to time. And you know, in that connection, what I try and steer clients toward is about 90% of your verbal traffic ought to be direct requests, shouldn't be complaints. But when you do need to complain, here's how I recommend that you do it. So the feedback wheel is a way of asking for repair. It's about bringing a complaint to your partner and then giving them an avenue of repair. So it has a few steps. So it kind of has a preamble. So in order to use any tool, what we got to do is stop, take that breath, and assess, where am I right now? What am I about right now? Am I in my wise adult or my adaptive child? How do I know that? Well, if I'm telling myself a story, for example, about what I'm going to do, if she says that, I'm in my adaptive child. And I need to stop and kind of get myself grounded and centered. Right? I need to regulate my self-esteem. I need to kind of put my boundaries in place and do some of these other things that you've heard me talking about. So there's this part of, where am I? There is another step. I remember love. The whole point of me doing any of this stuff in this moment is to get back into connection with my partner. It's not to nail him to the wall. It's not to make a point or to be right. It's to get back into repair. And so this is just kind of one way of doing it. So if I've answered those questions in the affirmative, right, I'm ready to go, I'm centered, then I go to my partner, I contract to speak. Hey, I've got a few things I'd like to talk with you about. This should only take a couple of minutes. Are you available for that? So if your partner's available, I tell you, yeah, I can listen. If they're not, then you ask them when a good time will be. So there's this, again, there's an ongoing conversation about, okay, maybe this isn't the right time, but can you tell me when it is? So I have some sense of like, we're going to work on this together. And I'm not being, I'm just taking distance from me. For example. Okay. So my partner says yes. And so then I use the feedback wheel. So a few steps. The first step is kind of what happened. And it's really specific. So a couple of sentences about what you saw or what you heard that bothered you. It has to be specific, right? It can't be like, I don't like your attitude. I didn't like your attitude at the restaurant the other night. It needs to be something much more actionable. For example, you told me that you would be home for dinner with me and the kids last night. You said you're going to be here at 7:30 and you showed up at 7:45 without calling or texting. Like it's behavioral. It's something that a video camera would record. A video camera doesn't record attitudes or vibes or those kinds of things. So what I saw or heard, you told me the other day I was just like my dad. Okay. So something behavioral. The next step is what I made up about it. It's important that we use those words. Again, no more than a couple of sentences, or we risk kind of overwhelming our partner and making them feel stuck. Right? I can talk more about what that is later. But what I made up about it is you can be narcissistic and selfish, that you prioritize your feelings and needs over mine. What I made up about it is that this is going to be a pattern that we're never going to get out of, something like that. A couple of 2-3 examples. The beauty in that is when I say what I made up about it is, I'm not saying this is the objective truth. I'm just saying this is what I made up about it. So you get a little license there, not to hit your partner over the head, but to just kind of acknowledge this is the story that I'm telling myself about it.
What I think is so powerful about that, Trent, and sorry to interrupt, is that it's an acknowledgement of, hey, this may not be true, but this is how I'm feeling in this moment.
Yeah, exactly. And imagine how it might go of like, this is what happened. This is what you did. I know it. I remember it. And, the results are fairly predictable from there. So this is what I made up about it. And then how I feel about it. And we want to stick to kind of like the primary feelings: joy, fear, pain, shame, guilt, love, and there's one other. I never remember them all, but kind of the primary feelings. And there are a million different shadings in that palette. I felt embarrassed. I felt lonely. I felt scared. I felt alone. Right? So we use those kind of feeling words. You don't want to lapse into like, I feel like you're being a jerk, because that's an opinion. Right? That's not a feeling.
That's not it. And that's not about you.
Yeah. So use the feeling words. And then next, we want to give our partner a way to do it, to make it right, an avenue of repair. What I'd like from you right now is I'd like an apology. And I'd like you to assure me that we're going to work on this together, or that it's not going to become a pattern, or that you talk about it with Trent, or whatever that needs to be. So a lot of times it seems to consider, this is a hard step for people. Sometimes people want to say, what I want is for this never to have happened. Well, you can't really do that. It has to be something that they can actually take action on in the pretty near term. So usually an apology, right? I'm sorry. Yeah, I did that. I'm really sorry. And yeah, I'll work on it. Or, okay, I'll go to my psychiatrist and get evaluated for anxiety meds again, or whatever that needs to be. So apology, some kind of assurance, usually. Doesn't have to be that. That's just what I seem to notice most of the time. And then finally, the toughest step of all, you let go of outcomes. So if I bring my partner a feedback wheel, right, and I'm in my relational integrity, I'm in my wise adult, I've kind of done the preparatory steps, and I bring them a beautiful, like really well done feedback wheel. I let go of outcomes, my job is done. Anything that happens after that is not up to me. How my partner receives it, whether they agree or not, whether they stay in their wise adult or not, is 100% out of my control. So that's the tough spot. I've done my job. And the way we describe it in the RLT community is if that all happens, I've done my work, right? And my partner responds, well, that's great. Then we're back in connection and we're kind of down the road. If they don't, for example, then what happens, that becomes a good relational moment for me. It becomes a so-so relational moment for the relationship because one of us is in our wise adult, as opposed to both of us being on our adaptive child. But it's not such a great moment for my partner, okay? So it's a little bit of all of those things when my partner doesn't show up. Still a good moment for me. I'm in my relational integrity. I'm practicing the skills. Right? That's what we want. But that's where detaching from outcomes, letting go of outcomes serves us because I don't have any control over the outcomes.
I think what I love about that is two things. One, it kind of stops the management of each other.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that there's a whole lot of agency in it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a ton of agency in terms of kind of controlling, deciding what part of the equation you want to be, what part of the dynamic you want to be, if you want to continue the pattern or break the pattern for yourself.
Yeah. I love that. I like how you say that.
Yeah, there's a lot of power in that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's one last tool I want to talk about, which is, and this is the tough part because this is not the end in mind, but I'm sure there are times where relationships don't work out or they're not healthy or people perhaps at their time of being together comes to an end. There is a process called, is it relational reckoning? Am I getting that right? Will you tell me what that is and how people come to the decision about whether or not it's time to stay together or go their separate ways?
Yeah. So relational reckoning is there to help us when we are unsure whether or not we should be in the relationship or if it needs to continue. We use relational reckoning both kind of in the near term for, I guess, I would say like smaller disappointments and things that we need to grieve. And we also use it for larger things like whether or not the relationship is actually working. So it's basically just a cost benefit question that we ask ourselves, which goes something like this. Am I getting enough from this relationship, enough good stuff, enough juice to make the things that I'm not going to get worth grieving? To your point earlier, nobody gets everything they want from their partner. Now, I'm not talking about, real violations, right? Okay, you've had another affair. Am I getting enough from this relationship? That's not what that's about, right? This is more like, well, for example, in the near term. We spoke earlier about, those moments where you're just being confronted with a partner that's letting you down. I wanted my partner to listen to me or to show up in a certain way or to respond to my feedback wheel in a wise adult way. And that's not what's happening. And in this moment, like, this sucks. I don't like it, right? But I'm accepting that this is what's happening. And acceptance here doesn't mean liking or agreeing with it. Still sucks. Like, this is not what I want. But my relational reckoning in that moment may help me see I get so much from this relationship here, a lot of love and a lot of support, a lot of wise adult behavior from my partner normally. I can grieve this loss. So I grieve it by just saying to myself, yeah, this is awful. This is not what I wanted. And I don't want to act out my disappointment in the relational field. So I grieve the loss, don't like it, doesn't mean it's okay, doesn't mean that I'm not going to ask for my needs to be met at another time, but in this moment, right? So there's a lot of moment to moment mindfulness that's happening in all of these things. I grieve it because I get so much over here that it makes this loss worth grieving. So I can do it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Of course. So the larger version is, again, am I getting enough from this relationship that it allows me to stay in? Do I want to do this work or not? And this is the question that we can ask ourselves.
Yeah.
Now you may say no. The answer may be no. And that's why people like me have jobs, right? You go to therapy, you work on it, you really fight like hell for what you want, you learn the skills, and you keep after it until, again, you can't answer that question with a, yeah, I'm getting enough, and then maybe something else is required.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting process. I think it's something that you could apply to other aspects of your life too.
Mm-hmm.
So you could apply it to your work, your job, a particular situation.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a real powerful question to ask yourself when you're unhappy or dissatisfied.
Yeah.
Okay. So you pull a great deal from Terrence Real, as we mentioned before, and Esther Perel, actually.
I do.
And which I love. Both very modern, both very actionable, both, in my opinion, whether they intend to do so or not, kind of eradicate shame in the way they bring all these different situations to life and to light. But there's another aspect that isn't just you're an interesting person, and that there are a lot of you're very rich in terms of all the things that you bring to the table. You're also a very spiritual person. And what I want to know more about your practice, and you're studying to become a Buddhist priest.
Yeah.
And I want to know which came first. Was it did you become a therapist first and then decide to get into Buddhism? How did that all play out?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we've got a couple of hours booked here, because there's a story here.
Oh, I want to hear it.
Okay. So, where do I want to start with that? So 30 years ago or so, I started going to therapy myself. And, in the beginning, I was kind of using therapy as a way to go and complain about other people, basically. And I had a wonderful, kind, and strong therapist, who's a male therapist, who would kind of help me see over time, this thing you're doing, right? I don't think it's really helping you. And so, I was in this great therapeutic relationship where, and I had grown up like hungry for like male mentorship and teaching, and I didn't get a lot of that. So I really was appreciating that about him. And throughout the course of our therapy, he would occasionally make references to the Buddha's teaching. And I've always been a very kind of spiritually oriented person, right? That's kind of normal for me. And so at that time of my life, I was also really longing for a spiritual practice that felt really good for me. I hadn't really found anything that was landing. So he would make these, he would say things about Buddhism, and I was curious about it, and he'd tell me a little bit more, not from like an evangelical standpoint. He was just responding to my inquiries. And he was helping me see how a lot of the Buddha's teachings were relevant to psychotherapy and relevant to how I could learn to work with my mind and my distress and my emotions and do something different, and help to do some things to get me out of my repetitive kind of suffering cycle. He also had a ton of books, and I was like, "Ooh, what's that? What's that?" And he'd loan me books, and I'd come back and discuss them with him. So I was like really, really impacted by this. And typical for me, when there's something that I'm into, like I go all in, like I jump in with both feet. And so eventually he helped me find a meditation teacher in a local center where I began practicing. And, I moved into doing weekend retreats and working with a meditation instructor and kind of really, really practicing. And I noticed my life starting to change. Right? I noticed how I related my experience was beginning to change. This was all happening shortly after I had finished my undergrad degree. I'm kind of a late bloomer academically, intellectually, I guess you would say. And so I finished my undergrad degree later than most people do. And at the time, I really wanted to be a professional historian, like stay in academia. I was really motivated by ancient history, classics. And it had some professors in an undergrad. I was a little older than the other students. They were like, you're pretty mature and pretty savvy about this kind of stuff. If you're interested in kind of moving on, we can help you. We can write recs. So I was very like, that's where I saw myself going. One of the reasons I chose not to go that academic route was my son lived here in town, and I didn't want to move to another city to pursue graduate studies or a PhD and not be where he was. It was really, really important to me to be where my son was.
Yeah.
So I decided I didn't want to do that. At this time, I was in therapy and kind of exploring Buddhism in the way that I've described for you. So I was also kind of looking for, I wanted to go back to school. I really wanted to, find a career path. And so it dawned on me, oh, wait a minute, Buddhism is really kind of all about helping other people and being available for others. And I wanted to do something of service to other people. So I was exploring that with him one day, and it dawned on me, oh, a therapist, they help other people, and I'm really benefiting from this. This is a way that maybe I could help people. And I asked him about, like, how do you do this? What's being a therapist all about? And he said to me, I do not recommend this as a career for you. You're too angry.
How did that hit you?
Well, it stung a little bit, but I got it. I mean, I remember it's like, yeah, no, I get it. Like you have to be processed and mature and really have done your work to be able to assist others when, with their lives and when stuff comes up. So I kind of got it. I didn't resent him for it. I was like, yeah, I get it. It was a bit disappointing to hear, but I kind of knew that. I kept working with him, and a couple of years went by. And at some point he says to me, I think you're ready. I think you're going to be a wonderful therapist. Here's how I recommend you go about it. And that's what started the whole process so the Buddhism piece came first.
Okay.
Then the therapy piece. So, preparing for the GRE and doing volunteer work and community service work to get into school and all that kind of stuff, that all started happening then. But that's really where it all began.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes so much sense. So it was foundational. And then where are you now in that practice? What does it look like to become a Buddhist priest?
Well, so specifically for me, it would be a Zen priest. So in this Zen lineage that I practice in. So that is more of an outgrowth of a request that I made of my teacher. So there's actually some more story-oriented stuff here. So when I was in graduate school, I had heard from other people in the community around town about this guy in Austin who was a Zen priest and also a psychologist, psychotherapist. And people would describe him as like the best therapist in Austin. I'm like, I want to know this guy. His name is Flint Sparks, by the way. And so I was aware of him, didn't know him, knew a little bit about what he was doing. And then one day in grad school, I don't even remember who the instructor was. I just remember the instructor saying, we have a guest speaker coming, the best therapist in Austin who is also a Zen priest, and he's coming to talk to the class. And so I was like, right on. So it was Flint. And when he came to the class, his way, I don't even really remember what he said so much. I don't remember if he was talking like about Zen per se, but it was his way of being, just kind of the way he was in that environment.
Just his energy?
Just his energy. And I very quickly was like, what is that? I want that. What are you doing? And like, no, I really want that. And so that planted a seed in my mind that stayed with me for a while. Come to find out later on, that was the same reaction he had when he met his teacher. What is that? I want that, right? I want to learn how do you do that? Right? So I didn't see Flint much for the next couple of years. I kind of was trying to chase him around town and attend trainings he was doing. He was still training therapists at that time, and it never really happened. But eventually, I started practicing at a local contemporary Zen center that he and another wonderful teacher had established here in Austin, and started getting to know him a little bit better. And then, was attending trainings and doing groups and sitting zazen there and working with him more closely. And so he became my Zen teacher. So he is, he's an ordained Zen priest. He also has this thing called Dharma transmission. So in our Zen lineage, there's a lot of formality. It's a very traditional lineage. And so he did all of those formal things while he was working as a psychologist. And so I started getting interested in like being ordained. Like it's always been really important for me to devote my life to something that felt worthy, right? And this was that thing, right? And so I started asking him about it. And when you have Dharma transmission, that is a very formal, very rigorous process that a person goes through, after which the entire community, the community of teachers says, we authorize you to teach, right? You can now teach on your own. So he had that. That also gave him the ability to ordain priests. But I don't think that's really how I don't think he saw himself as ordaining priests. So me and a couple of his other senior students were curious about that. And so he's like, all right, let's talk about it. Let's see how we do this. So that's where the process started. For me, it looks a little bit different because most people that ordain as Zen priests, they do that living in monasteries, right? They do that there's a lot of training. It's kind of like getting a PhD in a lot of ways. It's very rigorous, it's traditional. And most people doing that are spending a lot of time in monasteries. And I really can't because I'm a householder and I have a lot of responsibilities and a family and clients that I care about and people that are relying on me. So spending an awful lot of time in monasteries is not a real option for me. So we're looking at creative ways to do that, to get me to the monastery enough where I'm getting that traditional, like the ritual training, and I'm working with him around the formality piece. But another kind of side to that is, and this is what I've learned from him in our work together. Ordination is really, it's not a credential. It's more of it's something you offer, right? It's a way of being in the world. So in my case, whether or not I actually complete all the fancy monastic stuff is less important than this desire to be ordained is really a confirmation of something that's already true. Right?
Yeah.
Because that really begins kind of in my own heart and in my own aspiration. So will we do all the formal steps? I hope so. And that's, I think I have full support from him in doing that. But what's even more important is how that aspiration informs how I am with others, right? So the way I've heard him describe it is being a Zen priest is like, you situate yourself in the house of the Buddha, right? You situate yourself there. And then you open the doors and you go outside and you meet people. So it's something you offer. It's not something you have. So traditionally, that includes wearing robes and, doing services for people and spiritual counseling. And, most priests in a Zen lineage are taking care of a temple. That's pretty common. I'm not going to be doing that. Right? Mm-hmm. So there's kind of a creative process of discovery right now going on that, is kind of helping guide how do we want to do this? And I'm not his only student that's interested in that. So there's a few of us that are kind of starting to work that out. So that's what it kind of looks like.
Yeah.
And there have been some other, ceremonial things that I've done to kind of like affirm that aspiration and to situate me in that legacy.
Like what?
Well, so for a lot of Zen students, one step that is available to you is taking lay vows, right? Lay ordination, what they call it. In doing that, there's usually some training that goes along with it, but you also sew a garment. It is a kind of a stylized version of Buddha's robe. So it kind of looks like a bib. It's called a rakusu. So you sew that in a very formal way with specific stitches and how you cut it. And it's not arbitrary at all. It's a very old tradition. So you can sew a rakusu provided you have permission from your teacher. And when you do that, you undergo a ceremony where you get your kind of Dharma name. You get a name that your teacher chooses for you. You get some kind of lineage papers, that show your connection, descent from every other like Dharma teacher, every other Zen teacher, all the way up to the Buddha. Right? Mm-hmm. So there's the Kechimiyaku is what it's called. It's the blood vein document. It kind of connects you to this ancient lineage. And so that's kind of like a lay ordination. That's nobody's required to do that, but it's just like a step of commitment that some people want to take. I took that step. So what's next is I'm not quite sure. I will be probably spending a little bit more time in, one of the training monasteries where I'll go for a week or two. Just to get that form. I like formality. I like ritual and ceremony and forms. Like Zen has a lot of forms, it's not, there's a lot of formality to it because it's really about upholding a tradition.
Yeah.
So I like that kind of stuff. So I'll be doing some more of that stuff as time goes on. A lot of that has to do with what else I've got going on in my life.
Yeah.
And, my family responsibilities and, work responsibilities and all those things need to be taken into consideration. Fortunately, I have a wonderful partner who is very supportive of all of this stuff. So I hope I'm answering your question.
Yeah.
But there's a lot
I think what's inspiring in that, Trent, is a lot of us keep ourselves from doing what we really want to do because we think we can't make the time for it, or we think we can't honor the process. And this is something where I feel like it's quite beautiful that you're letting it unfold organically. It sounds like you and your teacher are taking a very creative approach to it while still revering the process and not being deterred by any sort of rigidity, not saying like it has to be a certain way. You're also reminding me of something that a guest said early on, which was really powerful to me. And he said, and forgive me if I'm projecting onto you, but this feels like a calling. And he said to me, your purpose isn't what you do. Your purpose is who you are. And in a way, that's what you're articulating here.
Yeah.
So it's less about the process. While you're definitely revering the process, it's more about your intent, which I think is really beautiful. Okay, so now I want to get into the backstory, the nitty-gritty. Okay. Let's go there, Trent. So
cup of tea
you
here.
brought it up. You said you were a little bit of a late bloomer. And so I'm going to go there. What made you a late bloomer? I want the backstory. I mean, let's go back. You're half Mexican, half Texan, if I'm getting this right. I mean,
in a manner of speaking, yes.
Yeah, let's kind of who makes you who you are. What is this backstory?
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. There's a lot of backstory there. So I think as a kid, there was nothing particularly remarkable about me, bad or good. I wasn't a particularly good student or a gifted athlete. What I was very polite, very outgoing and friendly. I really wanted to connect and be friends with people. I was funny. I learned how, in many ways, to make people laugh as a way to, of course, find approval from others. And I was very musically inclined. Right? But I came out of my childhood extremely insecure.
What made that the case?
Well, so for example, like my parents were authoritarian, intrusive, controlling, very rigid, and they were not the least bit psychologically minded people at all. They had very little interest in why they did what they did or what other people, or why other people did what they did. And I know that they loved me. Right? It took me a while to reach that conclusion, but I know both are true. The impact that had on me was this deep-seated belief that, of course, you have seen in action in some ways, that what I want doesn't matter. I'm not important. Nobody cares about what I have to say. My thoughts and feelings and desires and beliefs and interests and whatever, that just doesn't, it's not, they're not important, right? So I carried that around, and still do, by the way, for years and years and years. And I think growing up, I kind of, what that led to for me was my response was this kind of defeatist, like, doesn't matter. And this is kind of how I felt as a kid. It doesn't matter. Like, whatever I want, somebody's just going to take it away. So don't even try, right? Just don't say anything because you're going to look stupid. Don't ask for anything because somebody's going to say no. Don't get too involved in anything because somebody with more power is just going to take it away. Right? And that's kind of how I operated. So the core message that I got, and I do not think this is what my parents intended, by the way, was we don't approve of you. And I was never quite sure why, because I wasn't a troublesome kid, committing crimes and destroying property or causing problems for other people. But that was the message that I got. So what did I do? I sought approval in other people, became kind of a funny guy. Not so much a class clown, but there could be times when my behavior in class would get me into trouble, because I was doing things that, people are going to love this. They're going to think this is hilarious, especially the adults. The adults did not find it hilarious. And so, that could get me into some trouble, but it was really about approval seeking. So talk about boundarylessness. That was me as a kid. I can't feel good about me unless you feel good about me first. So there was all this, dancing that I would do to try and get people's attention. Do you like me? Am I okay? Do you think I'm smart? You do? Okay, good. You don't? Oh. So a lot of times when I look at pictures of me at that age, and I just saw somebody the other day, they're all of me looking down. I'm all looking down like this. So I think there's a lot of shame.
That breaks my heart, Trent.
Yeah. Yeah. I've done a lot of work around that. A lot of therapy, a lot of spiritual practice, a lot of, grieving. And I still do to this day. Now, come to find out, both of my parents had experienced significant complex trauma as kids.
Oh.
Now, I didn't learn more about that until, more into my professional development, understanding kind of what that was. And I'm not entirely clear the impact it had on them. But I think one impact was, a very limited range of emotions, and a lot of rigidity, and a lot of black and white kind of thinking.
So it potentially could have been passed on to you, even if it wasn't through them directly.
Absolutely.
Through their actions, meaning.
Yeah.
It could have just been multi-generational.
Multi-generational. They got it from somewhere. And, like my mother, who is still alive, if I ask her about those things, she describes in a very matter-of-fact way, oh, that's just kind of what happened. And you pick up and move on. And, I don't think there's anybody in my parents' families who were talking about trauma and kind of being relational and being connected.
Yeah.
So I don't think, for the most part, anybody was doing that deliberately.
Of course.
This is the legacy.
Yeah.
We pass it back or we pass it on. So a lot of that stuff got passed on to me. So that's how I kind of operated as a kid. That was what I believed about myself and believed about the world. So, so as I think about kind of what has led me to be kind of how I am now, like there are different like small moments that stick out in my mind from like media things or encounters that I had with other people or just things that I heard that for whatever reason really stick out. One is, so in about the mid 70s, I'm carrying all this stuff around that I was describing for you. But in the mid 70s, there was a TV show on called Kung Fu. Starred, you remember that?
Of course.
David Carradine?
Yeah, of course.
So, in the show, if you remember, right, the lead character, Kwai Chang Caine, was a Shaolin monk who had been exiled from China for whatever reason, was in the Old West, like in the gold rush or something like that, wasn't wearing robes any longer and had longer hair, but he wandered through the West doing odd jobs and spoke in a very soft voice and in parables and, was always offering these teachings basically on compassion, right? And it would also be, the show would also contain these flashbacks that he would have to moments with his teacher. The teacher called him Grasshopper. Right?
Yeah, the pebble, when you can take the pebble from my hand,
all
right?
Of that, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So I didn't really care so much about the Kung Fu. Of course, he was a Kung Fu master, and he was like, whenever there was injustice in the Old West, he would bring out the Kung Fu and right the wrongs. I wasn't so interested in that. I was interested in the way he was, the way he spoke, the way he was in the world. I was like, that's how I want to be.
Again, attracted to the energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was very clear to me at the time, but I was like, that's how you're supposed to be in the world. Now, that is not how my family life was at all, but it made that impression on me. Oh, yeah, that's how you're supposed to be. Later, there was a second thing I saw on TV that made a huge impact on me. And this was probably late 70s, early 80s. Right before he died, I saw a 60 minutes biography on Bob Marley. And I remember seeing that, and I was aware of who he was. I'm really so much into listening to him. I didn't know a lot about him, but I remember seeing him and thinking to myself, that is the highest form of human evolution. Who this man is here, like you can't go any farther than that. That's what a prophet looks like. That's what a saint looks like. And again, these weren't like fully formed ideas, but I'm like, that is the highest form of evolution for a human being is what this man is doing. I didn't even know what he was doing and couldn't really understand what he was saying, but it stuck in my mind. I was like, whoa, you can probably see that interview now on YouTube, right? And you will still get the same energy, right? There's this potency there. So I kind of shelved that away. One of the things that I always carried with me was my love of music. Like I came into the world, I think, musically inclined. I loved music. I wanted to play instruments. I wanted to perform, kind of wanted to be a rock star, but my parents made it clear there will be none of that. Right? That just ain't going to happen, right? And so in addition to this kind of sorrowful kind of helplessness, there was this rage that I carried around with me. Like, you know, you're telling me who I can and can't be, that kind of thing. And so, you know, my parents were clear, like, there ain't going to be no guitar playing or any of that kind of thing happening, you know, and long hair. My parents were not Beatles fans. They were not hippies. None of that kind of stuff. They just weren't interested in that kind of thing. I was. And so over time, like I loved music. And I tended to kind of see music when I was young as the way that I defined myself, because listening to music would give me a sense of like soothing and feeling good. And I learned that like listening to music, I kind of have some impact or control over how I feel. It feels great listening to Sgt. Pepper's, right? And so that was my way of kind of like feeling good. Now, naturally, I wanted to learn how to play music and grow my hair and all this stuff, but that wasn't going to happen. As this, let's just say my family dynamics continued to pace, right? And as I became a teenager, they became much more troublesome and much more painful. One of my ways I kind of see now of like feeling that sense of efficacy and power and, you know, those kind of dopamine hits of good music or whatever that might be, was listening to heavier and heavier music. So I started getting really interested. And so where I grew up in San Antonio, you had top 40 radio, right? Which was great. You heard everything on top 40 radio. Casey and the Sunshine Band, and then you'd hear Led Zeppelin, and then you'd hear the Commodores, like just great stuff. There was also FM radio rock, and that's where you'd hear more Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and AC/DC and just kind of like the heavier stuff that you didn't hear on AM radio. So for me at that time, the heavier, the darker, the better, right? I was like, all right, like this is where the power is and the energy, and that's what I want to be doing, man. So it was like really strong in me. And of course, my parents like were terrified by that, which felt really good. I was like, yeah, of course you're terrified, right? So that was kind of what took me up through those, you know, middle school years, I think. And let's see where do I want to go with this.
I know where I want to go.
Where do you want to go?
The punk band.
Oh, okay. I was thinking you might go there. So here's how that happened. Just a backstory here, right? So I'm thinking about right around the 5th grade. That was 1977 or so. The Sex Pistols were a thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Huge fan, by the way.
Yeah, well, me too. I wasn't at the time. I didn't know anything about them, wasn't listening to them. They didn't play them on the radio, but you were hearing about them because they caused a sensation and a stir everywhere they went. I remember kids talking about them in school, like, my uncle saw them and they pee on the audience. They never did anything like that, but there are all these stories about these terrible people. So if you know anything about the Sex Pistols history, they never really toured. They didn't play in Los Angeles or New York, but when they toured the States, their management deliberately booked them in places where they would cause the most trouble. And that was the American South. So where they played was Dallas, San Antonio, Baton Rouge, Tulsa, Oklahoma, places like that, right? Where people were, of course, going to freak out. So I remember when they came to San Antonio, I didn't see them, like I wasn't listening to them or anything, but it was in the air. Like people were terrified. Oh my God, like what is happening? And it was on the news and church groups were like having, you know, prayer meetings, and it was like the end of the world was coming, right? So I was just aware of that happening. And that was really it. You know, it came and went, and, you know, there was not much more about it. A couple of years later, I don't remember exactly how this happened. I was with a friend, and either he had the cassette of Nevermind the Bollocks, their album that they released. I was like, yeah, I want to hear that. So he put it on, and just from the intro to Holidays in the Sun, the first track, that kind of marching sound, I was hooked. I was like, this is where it's at, man. The energy, the power, that like made Led Zeppelin and Judas Priest pale to comparison with like the rage and the anger that I kind of was taking from. I was like, oh, that's what it is. So as I mentioned earlier, if I really get into something, I go all the way. So I went all the way. The appearance,
I need pictures.
all of that stuff, man.
Okay.
Back then, at least where I grew up, like when I was 16, I pierced my ear, and that was huge. That was like, I remember coming to school with that pierced ear, and it was like the earth stopped turning on its axis.
That was a statement.
It was a big deal. And again, it's just passé, right? But at the time, at least this is what it seemed like to me, I wasn't on campus for 10 minutes before they hauled me into the office and, what are you about? And what are you doing? I'm like, what am I about? I'm 16. I don't know what I'm about. And so like, was this kind of like a lot of energy around it. Over time, what happened is I started meeting other kids, that were into it. And it turned out that San Antonio had its own kind of punk scene.
Mm-hmm.
So I wish you didn't know you were going to get like a musicology lecture here.
We haven't talked about this, but I went through my own punk phase. Was super into Johnny Rotten and the Milkmen, and even Jeff's. I don't know if you know this. Do you know that Jeff's distant cousin is Jesse Sublett, who was in the Skunks?
He did mention that.
So we have like ties to punk. But keep going because I'm riveted. I want to know how you ended up in a punk band.
Okay, so long story short, you start meeting other people, and one of the things that was happening in punk at that time is this is past like the Pistols and the Ramones and the Clash and that early kind of punk stuff. Excuse me. There was this what I felt was like this uniquely American expression of it. People calling it hardcore.
Mm-hmm.
So those were the bands that were coming out of L.A. and Boston and New York and Washington D.C. They were all populated by young kids, like people my age, who were putting out records and touring and doing fanzines. And so that was this DIY ethos. And it was like fascinating to me. So I kind of got the idea, maybe I could do some of this, So me and friends would get together and we'd try and put bands together and, with limited success. And I was in one band that was a pretty good band, but I wound up getting kicked out because it was too unreliable. Like my life was so unstable and I was so like out there that, you need reliable people if you're going to make a band work. And that just was not me at the time. So San Antonio kind of had its established scene. There was a band in San Antonio that had a reputation and had been playing for a while and that I had seen out in the community, kind of knew the guys from the band just from going to their shows. At some point, they were looking for a singer, and they were auditioning people, and somehow or another, they invited me to do it. I auditioned. I was still in high school at the time, and I got the job.
Wow.
So this was a band that was, pretty close to doing some cool things, recording, touring. None of that really happened. In hindsight, what I've learned is that band was already they were already done by the time I joined. I didn't know that at the time. I joined a band that was well-rehearsed. The good musicians had a good reputation, was set to tour. We played some out of town and kind of in a big fish in a small pond type of way. But what I got from that was not so much the band itself or that punk stuff was so formative. I got approval, right? I got people thinking I was cool. Not everybody thought that about me, I don't think. But again, that felt really good. That didn't last for very long. Like that band, we had some fun, right? And got to see a lot of great bands and play with great bands and have experiences that most young guys that age don't get to have. So, it wasn't all bad. But it was, I never thought about it as like, this is going to be a lasting thing. This is what I want to do, right? So after a couple of years, the band was done and we kind of went our separate ways. And I had become kind of disillusioned with that whole scene. It was really getting more into my spirituality. I wasn't really aware of it at the time, but I was about 20, maybe 20, 21. I was growing my hair out. I was reading Carlos Castaneda and Aldous Huxley and, really kind of, Krishnamurti and trying to, answer the spiritual longing that I had. Didn't really have the language for it, but that's where my head was at the time. And also at the time, the music that I was listening to was reggae. So I am a lifelong devoted reggae fan, but not just any reggae, the roots reggae, right? The Rasta music, right? The spiritual music was what I love. So I'll go on record saying, right, that the sons and daughters of Jamaica from in the 60s and the 70s produced the finest music that the world has ever heard.
Okay, you're making me want to go back now because I went through a reggae phase too. So now I kind of want to go back to the roots of it.
Yeah. So I haven't left that phase. Like that has been a lifelong love for me, but a very specific kind of reggae. At this time that I'm describing for you, I was listening to a lot of Bob Marley. And what was happening was I was being impacted by the message. So there's the rhythm that is undeniable. You just can't resist it, right? But then there was also this message about peace and love. And there was a very spiritual message and universal brotherhood and Jah Rastafari. And, I remember listening to Bob Marley, like if you remember the song, We and Them, there's a lyric in there that says, someone will have to pay for all the innocent blood that's shed every day. Children, mark my words, it's what the Bible says. That blew the top of my head off. I'm like, what? Like, what is this, right? And so I was deeply impacted by the spiritual. There's no way for me to overstate, like still to this day, that just lifts my spirits. And that's where I go when I need that.
It's almost like your gospel music.
It is absolutely. What's interesting about it is gospel music, in my opinion. These are people, many of whom lived in the kind of abject poverty and violence that most Americans will never know. And here's what they were doing. They were singing praise music. They were singing music about social justice and equality. And of course, there was interspersed with all these references to the Old Testament and the Bible. And so like that to me was like, this is how this is real spirituality. These people have got it figured out. So that was another formative thing that awakened my spirituality. That in itself is almost solely responsible. So I was like, these folks have got it, natural living, being a vegetarian, living in a natural way, universal love and brotherhood. I'm like, now you're talking my language. So that's really where my spiritual practice really took off, because then it became clear to me, this is what I want my life to be about. And I didn't always stay like that, but that was really where that awakening happened. So
fascinating, because the juxtaposition of that from like the punk movement and kind of like breaking free, almost like you had to individuate from your family, but then you kind of had to find your own center point, you know, what resonated with you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's super fascinating.
So that, of course, like everything else, like when I get into something, I get into it. So I was like, this is the way I'm meant to live. Like, I want to become a Rastafarian and move to Jamaica and live all my life like this. And so, I did the research. I was, I made myself familiar with like who Marcus Garvey was and who Leonard Howell was and who Paul Bogle was and who Granny Nanny was and all these people that would thematically show up in a lot of these songs, because these were cultural heroes to the Jamaican people, I assume, right? And so I wanted to know who these people were so I could understand what they were saying. So I was convinced that this was how I wanted to live, and that was sincere for me. So I grew dreadlocks, and
Oh my gosh, I really need pictures of all these phases.
I'll show you some.
Okay.
So then another thing happened right around that time, and let me know if I'm telling you too much.
No, this is what I want to know. What are the formative moments?
So here's another formative moment. This is hugely formative. So Buddhism and going to therapy, that happened later. So we're talking now around 1986-ish or so. Not really doing the punk thing anymore. Still kind of trying to put some bands together, but it just wasn't happening for me. Listening to a lot of reggae, really being impacted by the music. And so if you think back on your punk history, there was one punk band that had a tremendous impact on me. And this band's called Bad Brains.
Oh, I didn't know Bad Brains.
Yeah. You need to know Bad Brains.
Okay.
So what made them unique was they were Rastafarians. They were these 4 African-American guys from Washington, D.C. who played punk rock, but somehow or another were exposed to Rastafarian teachings, and they became Rastafarians. So they played punk and they played reggae. They are also the best band that I have ever seen live. So I was aware of them when I was in high school. And so I was aware of their kind of reggae thing and the Rastafarian kind of message, and was very clear in their music. And so they were very different than the other bands they were playing around. And so I always loved them. So 1986 or so, I was with a buddy of mine. We went to this record store that we like to hang out in. And at the time, I was recovering from a knee surgery. So I had a big immobilizer on my knee and I was on crutches. We went into this record store, and I knew the people that worked there. And one of the guys said, "Hey, Trent, Bad Brains are playing in Austin tonight." And they had been broken up for a while. But I'd heard they'd had a new record come out. I didn't know they were playing in Austin. So I heard that, and I turned to my friend and we're like, we need to go and see them right this. So we got in the car and we drove right straight up to Austin, and didn't stop to get anything to eat. We're like, we must be there. So it was winter time, I believe. We get to Austin earlier. I'm still living in San Antonio at this time. And the show's the Continental Club, I believe. Mm. So we get there early and we pull up in front of the club just to kind of see what was going on. You know, you're a punk, you kind of hang out with people and make the scene.
On the street, yeah.
On the street and all that kind of thing. And so there's a tour bus in front of and it was early. It was probably like 3 p.m. Like we, again, very impulsively, we're going. Okay. Nobody there, right? But there was a guy hanging out in front, and he was this kind of this African-American guy wearing a kind of a knit tam on his head, which Rastas wear to cover their locks. And I just kind of, let's park the car and get out and check out what's going on. So we go walking up to the club. It's cold. I'm on this crutches. We walk up to the club, and this man just kind of walks up to me, and I will never forget. He says, "What happened to you, brother?" And there's those words just like, wow. And I realized that's HR. It's the singer for the Bad Brains.
Whoa.
Okay. And so I told him what was going on, and he was just listening to me. And again, spoke in a very soft voice. Right? Wow, I'm so sorry that happened. Why don't you guys come on and get warm? Let's get on the tour bus. And so, long story short.
Get out.
No. We spent the entire evening with him on the tour bus until they went into the club to play. And he was speaking to us about Rasta philosophy and answering our questions. And he was very warm and accommodating and just like a joy to be around. Come to find out, lots of people have had that experience with him. He's had a huge impact on a lot of people, right? But he certainly had an impact on me.
Yeah, but that still feels very divine. Yeah. That feels very divine, Trent. That was not an accident.
No, it wasn't an accident. So speaking with him, I was like, I've met the prophet. Like this man knows how we are supposed to be living. And so I became absolutely convinced of it. And, again, the encounter was lovely. Saw the band play, had a great time. He actually, I remember, he escorted me to a place on the stage where I could stand and wasn't going to get trampled by all the people diving off the stage.
So he showed you love and protection.
He did, yeah. So that was the end of the encounter, but I left that encounter going, this is what I want to devote my life to. And I think my friend kind of felt the same in a lot of ways. Over time, we saw the band a couple of other times, and he actually remembered us up to a certain point. So we hung out with them a couple of times subsequently when they came back. But it wasn't like a lifelong connection where I'm still in touch with him. It was just, that brief period of time. But that encounter had a huge impact on me. That was how I wanted to live. It further awakened my spirituality at the time. So I was like, yeah, this is what I'm doing. Rasta is the way to live. And there's still a big part of me that is convinced of that. There's so much goodness there.
I wonder what it would be like to reach out to him now and tell him that. And tell him what that encounter meant.
Well, in some ways I have. So this is probably close to 40 years ago when this happened. But I did reach out once, we have the internet and all this web pages and everything. And I reached out to his wife because he has had some mental health problems or he's got kind of some issues going on with his brain that makes him unable to do what he has done in the past. And so I think it's really changed how he lives his life. So I reached out to her and I said, I just wanted to kind of let you know, here's this experience I had. She wrote me back and said, yeah, a lot of people say that. And so that was really it. But that was my way of saying, your husband had a tremendous impact on me.
Yeah, so, a tribute.
Yeah. So that was another really formative event. And that kind of stayed with me for many, many years. Still has, obviously.
Yeah.
So that was, probably one of the most formative encounters. And then, from that point on, eventually I started a family and my attention went elsewhere and I wasn't so, lodged within that particular spirituality, but my life was always being informed by, I was always listening to reggae and always kind of taking in those words, and the messaging really meant a lot to me. Until later on when I went to school and figured out I could actually do really well in school. I wasn't a good student as a kid, but once I got into college, I did really well. And went to therapy and met Flint, and all these other wonderful things have happened. But that's really where it all
Those
began.
are the formative.
Yeah,
okay. So now I'm seeing, I'm a relator, so forgive me.
Yeah.
But I think now I'm seeing also why I like you so much, because I see the rebel in you. In a good way. I mean that as a compliment.
Thank you.
Like not accepting traditional obstacles, not accepting the status quo, being accepting of others that are different.
Yeah.
Even seeking it out. And I think there's a real beauty in that. Okay, so I have a couple more questions left for you.
Sure.
One, how did you meet your amazing wife?
Yeah. So I met her at a meditation retreat. She's also a Buddhist practitioner.
Oh, I didn't know this. Okay. I'm learning all sorts of things about you guys.
Yeah.
Okay.
She is a powerhouse. So I met her at a meditation retreat in Colorado at a place called Shambhala Mountain Center. I think it's now called Drala Mountain Center.
Okay, I've heard of this place. Okay.
Yeah, it's great.
When I was considering silent retreats, I think it came up, if I'm not mistaken.
There was some silence in that retreat. I don't know how observant I was of the silence at the time, but so I think we had some mutual friends. She lived in New York at the time. She's lived all her adult life in New York until she moved to Texas. But we had some mutual friends, and somehow I was introduced to her, but we were kind of in this silent retreat, so there wasn't a whole lot of talking. But I think there was some kind of mutual interest or some attraction. But we met in I think maybe a break period. It was a Pema Chodron retreat, actually.
Oh, I love Pema Chodron.
Yeah, she's great. Another person who had a huge impact on me. But anyway, so we kind of met and stayed in touch for the next year or so after the retreat. That's where we actually met. But I was going up to New York to do some training in this Buddhist lineage that I was practicing in at the time. She was also part of it. And I remember seeing her at the center there. And I remember kind of waving to her, and she was leaving and she didn't wave back. So I figured, that's the way it goes. You win some, you lose some, and didn't think much more about it. Subsequently, I was back in New York and decided to reach out to her, and she's like, "Of course I remember you." And so we I think our first date was at the Met. We went to
that's very sexy.
That was really cool. So that's kind of where it all began. We were connected through this Buddhist lineage, and that's how we met. And we just kind of stayed in touch. And I would go up and visit her in New York, and she'd come down here and see me. There were a time when I really wanted to move to New York. It just didn't happen, but she was kind enough to move down here.
Yeah, that's a big deal. That's a big sacrifice, potentially.
It is a big sacrifice, yeah. I trust that it's been worth it for her.
And how long have y'all been married?
We have been married, let me see, 14 years.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
And how has your work, both with Buddhism and therapy, informed you as a husband and as a parent?
I hope it's made me more patient. It has helped me reflect more on my own behaviors that get me in trouble. I think I like to believe it has made me less reactive and less certain about myself, right? This beginner's mind place that kind of helps me see things freshly and without any certainty about. I don't always do this, by the way, but I think in general, it's kind of allowed me to move beyond a lot of these limiting stories that would be enacted in my marriage to a certain place or a certain point, and start doing these things differently because I've been motivated by wanting to be a more compassionate and better partner. Hopefully I'm successful at that most of the time. As you've probably heard me say, anything that I ask my clients to do, I'm doing them myself as a partner, not as a therapist.
Yeah.
So, I like to think it's made me more gentle and more just open and less defended.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has been because of her beautiful and loving gifts that she's given me that have helped me see that it's safe to do that. I didn't do it all on my own. I've got a great support in her in doing that.
Of course.
And, as a parent, I I have always been aware, but I think my Buddhist practices helped me embody this awareness on a good day, not all the time, that I don't want to pass on to my daughter some of the things that I got. Right? I never want her to wonder if she loved or accepted. Right? I never want that to be a question for her, and I hope it's not. So I am very aware. I've learned how to track my whoosh. I was training in that through like traditional mindfulness and sitting zazen long before I heard the whoosh. And so that has really, I think, supported me in paying closer attention to what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So I'm not always on automatic pilot and reacting and retreating or whatever that might be. So I think I'm a lot less likely to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to take a moment to personally thank you because you've made a very big impact on my life and Jeff's life as well. And have definitely made an impact on the relationships in my life. And I'm grateful for that. You've given me tools that have helped me become closer to everyone that I love.
Oh, we've been a good team.
We've been a good team. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I'd like to close by asking you, and this is a big one, but I think you and I share this in common. So I just want to hear your perspective. What's your hope and wish for humanity, Trent?
My hope and wish for humanity is that we continue to value practices and perspectives that promote relationality, that move us away from toxic individualism and toward mutual support, caring, and really a collective way of thinking, right? Individuality is only going to get us so far. Like we are going to make it together or we are going to perish together to one degree or another. So that's my hope, and that we begin to see that we are actually connected, that we are one. This idea that we're separate beings, right, that might make sense on a relative level, but we are part of one ocean. And it is my hope for humanity that we start acting like it.
Yeah.
So
amen, brother.
Yeah.
I mean, that is what this is all about.
I think so.
Well, thank you again for coming on, Trent. It's been a pleasure. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Was it what you thought it was going to be?
Well, I wasn't sure what it was going to be, but you know what? I showed up and I've really enjoyed myself. I'm glad I did.
Oh, good. Well, be
I
careful.
knew you were going to take good care of me.
Be careful. I might ask you back.
Oh, okay. Surely you have more interesting people than me to visit you again the second time.
No, me and the listeners are going to disagree with that now. We have proof. Well, thanks again, Trent.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
Okay.
Thank y'all for listening today. If you're so inclined, please follow, subscribe, download, share, all of the things so that we can keep going. We appreciate your support so much. If you're interested in learning more, go to thecoeffect.co.